Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series from BioCareers, the #1 online job board and career resource for life science postgraduates. This webinar series exposes you to a variety of career paths and puts you in contact with others, experts and peers, who can offer a wealth of career advice and information. Now, before we begin, a few words about the format. Our presenter will speak for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have a 20-minute Q&A session. Now, you can type in your questions at any time in the questions box of your control panel. So today we have a special event with a special guest, Darren Lafreniere. He will share his thoughts about management consulting and discuss every step of the consulting recruiting value chain. Darren Lafreniere is the owner and founder of Final Round Prep, a company that provides professional recruiting support to students and professionals who wish to pursue careers in the management consulting industry. Since 2009, Darren has helped clients in Canada, the USA, and Europe to obtain jobs to top-tier firms including McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, Bain, A.T. Kearney, Deloitte, Accenture, Capgemini, Secor, and ZS. Prior to his current role, Darren gained a wealth of experience in both entrepreneurial and consulting environments. As an entrepreneur, he spent 4 years selling high-performance aftermarket parts to customers across North America as the owner-operator of an auto parts company. After obtaining his MBA from the Richard Ivey School of Business in 2007, Darren joined A.T. Kearney and consulted clients across 7 major industries on various strategic issues including logistics optimization, organizational restructuring, and operational cost reduction. Outside of work, Darren proudly volunteers his time with the University of Toronto Volunteer Consulting Group as a regular judge at CASE competitions and as a guest speaker at various consulting and recruiting events across the GTA. Take it away, Darren.
So today we're going to be running the webinar, what you need to know and do to get a job in the management consulting industry. So I'm assuming everyone out there in the internet audience is curious, what is it that I need to do specifically to get a job in consulting? And I don't have a business background. Perhaps I have some business experience, but I don't have a business background. How can I translate my work experience into an application that is going to get noticed by the management consulting firms? And really that's what I'm here to do today, is to help you determine how it is you can do that. Okay, so just to touch on some of the points that were shared about my background, I did my undergrad at the University of Manitoba. I majored in psychology. So for perhaps those of you that are thinking, well, I don't have a business background, guess what? Academically, I didn't. Of course, I went on to do my MBA. But undergrad is something that the consulting firms are really interested in knowing more about. They're typically targeting people that have very technical undergrads, engineering, that sort of thing. I had an undergrad in psychology, so not the ideal background, but of course I was still able to convince the firms to bring me in for an interview. I started my career in business as an entrepreneur. You can see me there. I actually don't have a shaved head anymore. Well, there I am with a shaved head at a booth selling car parts. So I had Ford Mustangs was one of my hobbies, and I ended up starting a business selling parts online, and then I ran a speed shop where I sold high-performance car parts to local customers. And I also had a large online business as well, where I sold to customers across North America. At a certain point, I decided I wanted to make a change in my career. So I elected to do my MBA. I went to the Richard Ivey School of Business. It's located in London, Ontario, Canada. It's one of the larger and more well-known business schools in Canada. All the major consulting firms recruit there, so I had a great opportunity to expose to those firms. And post-MBA, I'm just going to grab some water. I was just commenting earlier, it's so cold here. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. It's so cold. We had a cold snap that hit us. I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. Sorry about that. Post-MBA, I joined A.T. Kearney. A.T. Kearney, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that firm. They specialize in operational strategy. They also have a very strong automotive practice, which of course was a great fit for my work experience background. And while I was at A.T. Kearney, in addition to doing project work, I was heavily involved in recruiting. So for candidates, whether they were BAs or undergrads, the business analysts or associates, I was the person that was supporting the review of the incoming applications, so resume and cover letters. And I was also very heavily involved in first and second round interview cases. So going through that process, I actually ended up volunteering a lot of my spare time. In consulting, they actually call it magic time. So you don't have a lot of spare time to do much beyond project related work, but I did find time to volunteer back at Ivy to help students prep for cases. And at a certain point, I recognized this is something that I'm really interested in. I'm very passionate about it. So I elected to leave AT Kearney and start a company where I would provide professional recruiting support to students. So that's what I've been doing since 2009. And again, final round prep, what do I do? Well, quite simply, I help students and working professionals, so folks just like you, obtain jobs in the management consulting industry. And I just wanted to quickly call attention to my website there. The address is finalroundprep.com. I have a lot of fantastic free resources for all of you to start prepping for developing your applications, networking, learning more about the industry, and of course, learning more and practicing case interviews. So I encourage you all to visit my website. All the resources there are free. And if you're interested, you can also follow me on Twitter. Obviously, Twitter is a fantastic resource for folks to get up-to-date information on various topics. And I leverage Twitter to tweet to my followers about any new resource that I find on the market. Maybe it's a video on YouTube, or it's a new blog post related to consulting. Anything that I find that I think is useful to help students prep, I tweet about. So it's worthwhile that you explore the opportunity to follow me on Twitter. Okay, so just wanted to lay out what my objectives are over the next hour. And granted, they're very aggressive. I totally understand that. But I want to give you as much information as I possibly can so that you get a very valuable experience out of your time with me in Bio Careers here today. So I want to give you an understanding of what consulting is really all about from a real world perspective. So I find that I try to provide a very honest perspective on my experience in consulting. And, at the end of the webinar, when I answer questions, please, any questions you've got, let me know. If you want to know what consultants make, I'll tell you what I know. If you want to know how bad the hours are and about the work-life balance, more than happy to share with you what my experience was. So give you that real-world view. I also want to help you understand what the firms are looking for and push you to define your personal value propositions to them. So the idea here is the folks in the audience, they don't necessarily have business backgrounds. I don't have everyone's profile, but let's assume that no one has a business background. How do you convince a business consulting firm, a strategy consulting firm like McKinsey, for example, to bring you in for an interview? Well, I'm going to talk to you about the things that they're looking for in strong candidates. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a business background. That's not the number one thing they're looking for. So I'm going to walk you through that. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of case interviews. So I'm not going to tell you how to crack every case, but I'm going to give you an overview of what the case interview process is all about and share some resources that you want to leverage to start learning more about them. And I'm going to give you a preparation plan. So ideally, you're going to start practicing cases very shortly. Regardless of whether or not you think you'll land an interview, case interviews are something you have to prep for right away, as early as you can. You need to spend a lot of time on that. So if you were to leave this webinar today, what would you do in terms of next steps? I'm going to share with you what you can do over the short, medium, and long term to start prepping for cases. I also wanted to share what this workshop will not do for you. So you're not going to learn everything you need to know about the various consulting firms and how they differ. It's a very common question I get that, my students will say, Darren, what's the difference between McKinsey, Bain, BCG? That's not something that we're going to have time to go through today. And quite frankly, that's a topic that all candidates need to explore on their own. So the idea of networking and reaching out to people at your target firms to book coffee chats, informational sort of interviews is what they call them. This is something that you're going to have to do on your own. So you're not going to get that out of the session today. I won't tell you how to easily write a perfect CV and cover letter, curriculum vitae, another word for resume. Hard work and multiple iterations are the key here. So I'm going to share with you some tips on how you can develop a good consulting resume, but it's going to take you time. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of rewrites in order to get a good management consulting application ready. And I touched on this briefly earlier, but I will not give you a silver bullet solution to solving cases. No such solutions exist. I jokingly say that if I knew exactly how to crack a McKinsey case, I could package up that process and sell it for $1 million. Obviously, I couldn't get $1 million. That'd be nice if I could. But the reality is that there is really no silver bullet solution to solving cases. You have to get out there and practice. But I'm going to share with you the resources you can leverage to practice more effectively and efficiently. I'm going to talk you through the steps in terms of prepping with your classmates, with your colleagues, with other people that'll help maximize your learning opportunities throughout that process. Okay, so what is consulting? This is something that everyone in the audience needs to be able to answer. Now, in a consulting interview, they're not necessarily going to say to you, what is consulting? But they will ask you why you want to do management consulting and why you want to work at their firm. So I wanted to quickly share an overview of how I would define management consulting. So when I'm asked what is consulting, I'll typically say, that depends. Can you please be more specific? The fantastic answer, that depends. So I think about consulting in 3 different ways. Actually, you're gonna hear about the rule of 3 as you start to prep for cases. The rule of 3, generally speaking, you want to come up with responses that you can group into 3s. So here is my rule of 3 in practice. What is consulting as a process? What is consulting as an industry? And what is consulting as a career? So these are 3 things that you need to start to research to better understand if consulting is the right fit for you. So with regards to consulting as a process, there's a couple books I'm going to suggest you get. The first is The McKinsey Mind. And this is readily available on Amazon. There's actually 2 books, The McKinsey Mind and The McKinsey Way. I mean, I've read both of them. They're both fantastic. Either one of them is going to give you a good understanding of how McKinsey approaches problem solving. But quite frankly, the approach that McKinsey uses is the same approach that any management consulting firm would use. So if you want to know how consultants work, that's a fantastic book that you can pick up and read. Also, if you're interviewing with McKinsey, perhaps it's something you can reference in the interview. I mean, if you know their lingo and understand their process, perhaps that would give you a little bit of a competitive advantage. The other book, it's Designing Solutions for Your Business Problems, and I apologize, it's small there, the author, but her name is Betty Vanden Bosch. So Designing Solutions for Your Business Problems, written by Betty Vanden Bosch. So I taught an undergrad class, so the HBAs or BBAs, I taught an undergrad business class, and this was the textbook that I used for that class. It was a consulting skills training class. So in terms of what do consultants do tactically, so if you think of the McKinsey Mind as being perhaps part theoretical and then part theory or part practice, the next book is actually very tactically how you can approach problem solving. So there's a lot of great tips in that book that you can leverage in order to crack cases and, quite frankly, in order to manage business problems or problems in general in your academic or in the real world. In terms of consulting as an industry and consulting as a career, there are a couple of resources you want to consider. Of course, BioCareers is a fantastic resource. So the fact that you're on this webinar right now, you've taken an important first step to learning more about consulting. I would encourage you to keep leveraging that website. It's a fantastic resource. But some other resources you want to consider, one is Glassdoor.com. It's a very large website, a lot of great information about various industries. But what I like about Glassdoor is that it presents information about the consulting industry in what I would sort of, liken to an analyst report. So you can search McKinsey and there will be a short summary of the firm, its size, its estimated revenues, number of offices. But even more importantly than that, there's quotes, comments, and feedback from actual McKinsey consultants. So you can actually get a really interesting view of the firms that you're looking for searching on Glassdoor.com. And a lot of the resources there are free. So great website to check out. Another website is Vault, so vault.com, and I'm sure that everyone is aware of Vault or has heard of it. If you haven't, definitely check it out. A ton of great information there, and they also have some consulting guides, how-to guides, so case interviews and recruiting and that sort of thing. So there's some great resources on the Vault website that you can leverage. And lastly, there's another good website called evisors.com. And what evisors is, it's basically sort of a little bit like eBay, but for experts that you can connect with. You schedule time with them to learn more about an industry, to get feedback on your resume, to do a mock interview. So if you think to yourself, I don't have a strong network in consulting, and quite frankly, I think it's challenging for a lot of people to network. Here's an opportunity for you to connect with people in the consulting industry at the firms you want to work with, and practice an interview with them, or ask them questions about their industry, their company, their role. And the good thing about this is that it's anonymous. So they don't have to know who you are unless you want them to. And I say anonymous as being very important because every time you interact with a consultant, you're being evaluated. So this is a great way for you to learn more about Bain, for example, to practice a case with a Bain consultant, and they really don't know who you are. So it's a good opportunity for you to leverage. And by the way, I don't receive any compensation for promoting any one of these websites. I just personally think that they're fantastic resources for students to leverage. Okay, so now digging in a little bit deeper. Generally speaking, there are 5 different types of consulting firms that you need to be aware of. So I've listed them out by type. So I think when people think of consulting, they think of strategy firms. Well, that's only one type of management consulting firm. And the reality is that even if it's a strategy firm like McKinsey's going to do a lot more work than just strategy. McKinsey's going to do sourcing. They're going to do procurement. They're going to do that sort of work as well. A lot of different work besides that, but strategy firms is just one type of consulting firm. Moving down, there are professional services firms, or what some people call mega firms. So these are firms that offer a wide variety of different services, of which consulting services is one. There are also IT consulting firms. I think if you think of IBM, CGI, Capgemini, Accenture, to a certain extent, Accenture has a very strong IT practice. Accenture is also a mega firm, but these are very specific firms that offer very specific consulting opportunities. You may have heard about boutique consulting firms. So these are, generally speaking, much like large consulting firms, but they specialize in a particular industry or functional area. And there's also a lot of internal consulting opportunities that are available. So I have some examples there that are strictly Canadian based. RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, BMO, those are Canadian banks. Rogers is a telco in Canada, but there's also those types of opportunities as well. So in terms of targeting consulting firms that you'd like to work for, start thinking about the type of consulting that you would like to do. Okay, so everyone is interested in strategy. So the MBB, there's an acronym that you're going to start reading about if you haven't heard about it already. MBB stands for McKinsey, BCG, Bain. So the top 3 consulting firms globally. I would say that there are firms like ATK, Booz, Monitor, who incidentally just got acquired by Deloitte. So I'm going to have to update this slide. That's actually a topic that you should do a little bit of research and homework on if you're interested in applying to Deloitte about their acquisition of Monitor, and learn a little bit more about the Monitor group. But beyond these strategy firms, professional services, so a big employer of students, undergrads, both business and non-business, is Deloitte. Accenture is also another one. IT, these are firms that are more implementation focused. So it's not necessarily that you're just doing IT-based work, but the work that you'd be doing within these IT firms is going to be a lot more implementation focused in nature. So pretty interesting and tactical work, of course, you do in IT. Boutiques, again, much like strategy. I think boutiques are pretty interesting. Part of the reason why they're interesting is because one of the challenges you're going to face if you begin a career in consulting is travel. So consultants travel a whole lot. And, at the large top tier consulting firms, and even at some of the large professional services firms, you could be traveling 4 days a week. So you're only home on the weekends. With some of the boutique firms, they're doing more localized work. So there's an opportunity for you to get into the consulting industry, start your career, and do work that's more based locally, which I think is fantastic. And of course, internal, I've heard great things. Now, I haven't obviously worked at an internal consulting role, but I've heard great things about internal consulting roles. Really what internal roles are is you're doing consulting, but your main client, your only client, is the parent organization that you're working for, okay? So 5 different types of firms. You can start thinking about the ones or the areas that you'd like to work in. Now, in terms of consulting as a process, I just want to quickly lay this out, and I don't think these steps are going to come as a surprise to anyone. You've likely leveraged this sort of process in the academic work or even the professional work you've done. But in terms of the consulting process, if you look at the top left, it starts with understanding a client's problem, generating some hypotheses or theories about what the issues are and what the potential solutions are, and outlining an approach. So tactically speaking, this is really the proposal phase of a project. So what's going to happen in consulting is typically the more senior leaders at the firm, perhaps the partners and the principals, are going to be pitching to clients. And before the work even begins, they're going to share with the client exactly what they think the problems are. And by the way, they may have done that specific type of work 100 times before, and perhaps even at that client's competitors. So they're going to share, what their thoughts are. They're going to share exactly how the project would be broken down. And that's really how they arrive at what the cost or the budget would be for that project. And then once the project kicks off, it enters into what I call the consulting black box. And if you think about what you would do in consulting, this is where you're going to spend all of your time, okay, in the consulting black box. So what are you doing? You're collecting data, qualitative and quantitative. You're going to be synthesizing that data, generating hypotheses. And when I say synthesizing, I mean you're going to be crunching numbers in Excel. You're going to be interpreting qualitative information you've gotten from the client via interviews. And I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone. I think everyone has done this type of work. So, one of the things I wanted to sort of plant in your minds right now is if you're trying to think about how you can convince a consulting firm that you'd be a good consultant, you want to share with them examples where you've collected data, qualitative, quantitative, where you've crunched numbers, where you've come up with findings, that sort of thing. And the process continues with client feedback and buy-in. So in consulting, there's a lot of interaction. So whereas some of the work that you may have done or do is perhaps done, in the lab on your own, perhaps with some professors or with some colleagues, in consulting, you're going to be working very closely with the client. So there's a saying that goes, good consulting is consulting with the client, not consulting to the client. So consulting is very collaborative in nature, but it's not only teamwork collaboration when you think about working with others at the firm. You're going to be working very closely with the client on the client side, sometimes on a daily basis. And of course, that work goes on and on, round and round, and ultimately you're going to derive some recommendations and share with the client how they can actually implement that, so an implementation plan. So that's, I think, a good overview of what the consulting process is. Now, in terms of what your role would be like within a consulting firm, and quite frankly, what I think the value proposition to you is if you join a consulting firm. Okay, so what I've done here is I've laid out some industries across one axis and functions across the other. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. There are many more industries that consulting is going to work within. There are many more functions. But just for illustrative purposes, this is what I've laid out. Now, if you think about joining an MBB type firm, what would the work that you're doing look like? So let's assume that you were doing work for a pharmaceutical company. You're going to get exposed to individual stakeholders across every major functional area or division within that organization. So if you think about the breadth and depth of experience you're going to get and exposure you're going to get working at that pharmaceutical client, it's just, in my opinion, unmatched. Any industry job, you'd have a very difficult time matching that exposure. And also, if you have the opportunity to join a strategy consulting firm and do strategy-based work, you're going to be doing strategy work across a wide variety of industries. So if you think about, again, the breadth and depth of experience you get within strategy, think about all the industries you're going to touch on. I know when I was working at A.T. Kearney, I worked at 8 clients across 7 major industries. So a fantastic opportunity from an exposure perspective. And of course, your career and the work you do could be any mix and match within this grid. So in terms of what the role looks like, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. And again, thinking about why you want to do management consulting, I think this would perhaps be part of a good answer, talking about the breadth and depth of experience that you get working with the clients that the consulting firm provides service for. Now, in terms of, let's say you join a firm, how does your career progress over time? So what I've kind of laid out here is one entry point is a business analyst. So if you're an undergrad or you don't have a significant amount of professional work experience, and this really varies, it depends on the individual and specifically what they've done and for whom. But generally speaking, if you're undergrad and you don't have a whole lot of experience, you would join the firm as a business analyst. And there, what are you required to do? Well, analytics, modeling, you have to know how to use PowerPoint, Excel. So you're basically a grunt or a grinder, as I've laid out there. It usually takes between 1.5 to 2 years for you to reach senior business analyst. So that, of course, is just the senior level of the BA. Typically, at that point, a lot of senior business analysts will leave the firm to go and do their MBA. Now, this isn't something that you have to do, but it's a good opportunity because all the major firms will support you financially to do your MBA. And I know that from a lot of the top firms, a lot of the SBAs are doing their MBAs at Ivy League schools like Harvard, Wharton, Kellogg, INSEAD. So a fantastic opportunity to launch your career in a different direction academically and have the firm support you financially. Another entry point is the associate or senior consultant level. So this is sort of what I would call the MBA entry point. Now, do you need an MBA? No, you absolutely don't. A lot of the major firms, I know McKinsey and BCG, they have special advanced degree tracks or advanced degree application streams for people that don't have a business background. You would, of course, have to have, I would say, now this depends, but I would say at least 3 to 5 years of real professional work experience. But if you join as a senior consultant or associate, what are you expected to do? All of the things that an analyst does, but at a more advanced level. But in addition to that, you're going to be doing more project management, more team management, and more client management. So you're expected to take on a more client-oriented role. Now, you're still going to be doing a lot of the same work that the analysts are doing, but of course, you're going to be taking on more client responsibilities. But you're still a grinder. So make no mistake about it. Even if you join at the MBA level or advanced level, you're still going to be doing all the grunt work. Now, 2 to 3 years beyond associate or senior consultant, you would typically advance to the manager level. Once you've hit manager, you're what I call a minder. So now you're going to be managing more work streams, involved with more projects. Perhaps you're moving towards subject matter expertise, which is really what a lot of folks do if they continue on in the consulting industry. Now, this really depends in terms of time, but 3 to 5 years after you've made manager, you'd advance to principal. And again, it really depends on the timing from principal to partner. Maybe 3 to 5 years, you'd advance to partner. Now, principals and partners, they're typically more focused on subject matter expertise. They're going to be focusing on business development. You can read more on the list there on the slide. So in terms of what your career looks like over time, hopefully this gives you a better understanding. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the consulting recruiting process specifically, so this is actually a very important point, in terms of what are the good times to be applying for consulting. Now, hypothetically, you can apply at any time. You can apply tomorrow. You can apply a week from now. But the best times to apply are when the firms are actually organized and ready to do recruiting. So this is actually something that all the firms they follow globally. Now, the timing may be a little bit off. I know that in Europe, it typically is about a month behind where it is in North America. So they're about a month later on, they're doing these things, but it's very similar. There's 2 times you need to be considered. So right now, Jan-Feb is when the firms are recruiting for summer internships, okay? So if you wanted to apply for a summer internship, now's the time you want to be doing it. Actually, you may have missed, unfortunately, some of the application deadlines, but summer internships, now is when they're recruiting for it. Also, if you're interested in a full-time opportunity, it doesn't mean that you can't apply right now. You absolutely can. And it's actually a good time to apply because in consulting, they don't have HR groups or HR individuals that are doing interviews with candidates. Okay, the consultants are actually the people doing interviews. So if you imagine and that consultants are very busy, it's not easy for them to dedicate time to recruiting. But during the Jan-Feb timeframe, they are or dedicating a lot of time to recruiting. So now is actually a good time to be submitting your application to the firms, even for full-time work, because there are people that are in the office reviewing resumes, and they're involved in interviews, okay? Now, the other time that's extremely critical and important for everyone in the audience is September and October, and of course, that's coming up quickly. So if you want a full-time job in management consulting, September and October is when the firms are going to be heavily recruiting. Now, they're going to be on campuses, conducting information sessions, inviting students for first, second round interviews. The whole process kicks off in September, and they're going to be making offers, full-time offers, starting in October for the following summer. So they're actually making offers in October and sometimes in November, but candidates won't be starting until almost a year later. So is this you? Does this work with the academics? Now, I know with PhDs, they don't necessarily have a firm time that they're going to be, done their degree, but something you want to think about as you're recruiting, you may not get brought in right away. There may be a long delay before you actually start your role with a consulting firm. And the other important thing is, again, in terms of the best time to be applying to a consulting firm would be in September and October, because those consultants are dedicating time to recruiting, and there's going to be people in the office that are going to have time to look over applicants' resumes and cover letters. Okay? Now, hopefully everyone's following along well so far, and I typically will take questions throughout a presentation, but in this format, we're going to keep them to the end. So if you have any questions, I just wanted to remind you, please type them in the question box that I'm assuming everyone's seeing on their screen right now. Okay, so now drilling down even a little bit farther. So let's say that you are lucky enough to be invited in for a first round interview. What does a consulting interview look like? Okay. So a typical consulting interview is around 45 minutes in length, perhaps an hour. It depends on the firm and timing and resource availability, but usually 45 minutes in length times 2. So that means for a first round interview, you're actually going to be doing 2 back-to-back interviews. So you meet with one consultant, go through the interview with him or her, and then immediately after that, you'll meet with another consultant. And the interview process, it's fairly straightforward, in terms of structure. So I have an example here laid out. This is going to be highly representative of what you would face with any consulting firm. So, and again, you're going to do this twice. So 2 times in a row. You're going to have some sort of ice-breaking conversation. So this is pretty important, because as soon as you make eye contact with the consultant that's doing your interview has begun. Okay, so they're evaluating you in terms of behavioral or fit as soon as they make eye contact with you. And I know that a lot of the firms will perhaps put you in a boardroom or that sort of thing. Or if you're interviewing on campus, you'll be in some sort of holding room. As soon as they walk in and greet you, the interview has begun. Okay, so you're gonna have some light conversation. Then they're gonna start asking you those fit or behavioral questions. McKinsey actually calls it personal experience interview questions, or PEI questions. These are things like, tell me about a time when you led a team, that sort of thing. I'm gonna walk through those in a little bit greater detail later on in the presentation. But they're gonna ask you fit questions for perhaps 8 to 10 minutes. Then you're gonna get the case interview. We're gonna obviously talk about case interviews in much more detail. And lastly, they're gonna say to you, usually with about 5 minutes left in the interview, do you have any questions for me? Okay, so this is actually something that a lot of candidates don't think about, is that last part of the interview where you have an opportunity to ask them questions. So I would say this is just as important as the fit portion of the interview. So you want to start thinking, if you get an interview, what questions do I want to ask the consultant? What do I want to learn about the firm? So you can really come across as being very professional, very prepared if you have some good, strong questions to ask them at the end of the interview. And again, this is the process you're going to go through with every single firm. Okay, so drilling down further now, I could talk about resumes, cover letters, and behavioral interviews first, but I think the topic on everyone's mind is arguably case interviews. So let's just dive right in, okay? So what is a case interview? In terms of a definition, there's a lot of, I would say, definitions that are relatively good out there, but here's what I've come up with that I think sort of puts it in perspective a little bit, more easily for candidates. A case interview is essentially a job interview in which the candidate is presented with a business scenario. So I say business scenario because it could be a problem, a challenge, it could even be an opportunity. It's not necessarily always a problem that needs to be solved. It could be about a company wanting to grow. And the candidate is then required to resolve the issue. Okay, so that's, at a high level, that's what a case interview is. You get some sort of a business scenario and you're required to resolve that in a very short time frame, typically about 25 to 30 minutes. Okay, so once you're given the question, in terms of the steps you go through, one of the first things that you need to do, and we're going to talk about this in greater detail, but you have to scope the problem. Okay, so you need to make sure you understand what the client's issues are. You have to also understand what their objective is and develop an approach towards working to a solution or a roadmap to solve the problem. So the first thing you're going to do, scope the problem. The next step is analyze. So you're going to engage in what I call a collaborative Q&A with the interviewer, where you're asking them questions, they're providing you with information. Sort of think about them as a resource that has a lot of great information that can help you solve the problem. You just have to ask the right questions and work together with them in order to get that information. Then you analyze it and you generate findings. So I know everyone has done, analysis, right? It's basically a similar process, but you're going to be doing it collaboratively with the interviewer. So I always find it interesting when candidates tell me that they had a great case interview experience, and I'm like, well, what did it feel like? And they say it felt like a collaborative sort of problem-solving session. It felt less like an interview. So it's very collaborative in nature, the analysis process, and ultimately what you're trying to do is solve the problem. So you're going to analyze, you're going to come up with findings or generate solutions, but you have to determine how the client can go ahead and solve those issues, so provide them with recommendations, and also share with them what they need to do, so an implementation plan with which they can achieve those objectives, okay? So scope, analyze, and solve. This is very high level in terms of just what a case interview is all about. So now thinking about why do consulting firms give case interviews? Well, I think the first and most important reason why they give case interviews and what they're looking for is to understand your logical thought process. So how do you problem solve? Okay. The other thing they're looking for is your testing is your analytical capabilities. So it's not enough to be able to, think about how you can structure an approach to solve a problem. You actually have to be able to analyze and assess data and information. So it's not just math, although you will be doing some mathematical calculations in a case. Quite frankly, it's very straightforward, very simple math, multiplication, division. But they're going to test your analytical capabilities. And thirdly, and perhaps underlying the entire interview process, so the fit, the case, and candidate questions, they're going to determine your candidate's your client and project readiness. So this is almost like an X factor. Do you have the confidence that is required to successfully manage a project, to work with a client? I mean, I say that, thinking about what is on their mind as they're assessing you from a client perspective is they're thinking, could they staff you on a project as early as tomorrow and put you in a room with client stakeholders and feel confident that you'd be able to manage that situation, okay? So put another way in terms of, I think what makes sense, they're testing how do you think? How do you work? And how do you communicate, manage, and lead? Okay, so all these reasons, this is why they're giving you case interviews. So this, I think, is very interesting. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to make sure that these slides are available to you to download from BioCareers. So they're going to be made available to you. So I'm not going to go into this slide in any great detail, but these are actual real-world cases. Now they're summarized. So the case as it was presented was more detailed than this. So there's more information than just what you see on this particular slide, but these are real world examples from top firms of cases that they gave to candidates. So as you start to think about, okay, so I sort of understand what a case interview is all about. I get why it is they give case interviews. Well, what's an example of a case interview? Here's real world stuff. Some interesting cases there you'll see near the bottom. One firm gave the candidate a slide with a chart, and it had a curvy line on it, literally just some random curved line. No, the axes weren't labeled, and they spent 45 minutes talking about that particular chart. So pretty interesting. No matter what the candidates came up with, the consultant would push back and say, what if I told you this? What if I told you this? So cases aren't necessarily as clean and structured as you may read about or see in some of the case prep books. Another case, here's some financial info, build a pro forma income and cash flow statement. And that's pretty advanced. So I haven't seen this happen more than once in my 4 years of supporting students in case interview prep, but something you need to be aware of. And there's an interesting trend I wanted to share. In the middle of a case, a lot of the consultants are starting to stop the interview and say, the CEO just walked in, give them an update. So really what I think they're testing there is how well you can summarize the progress you've made up until that point and share with them or outline how you're going to continue forward within that case interview. So an interesting trend. So I'll leave this slide for you to read on your own when you get this presentation after the webinar. Okay, so case example. So how do you really succeed in a case? So I'm saying this is important. Of course, I think a lot of, or if not everything that I'm sharing with you is important, but this is extremely critical to consider what I'm going to share with you now in terms of how to succeed in a case interview. And I say that because you're going to pick up books. I'm going to talk about those books, but David Orval's Crack the Case, Mark Cosentino's Case in Point. I mean, these are two absolutely fantastic preparation resources you want to use. And they're going to share with you an approach that they believe you can leverage to crack cases. The challenge is you should not use those approaches exclusively, okay? So you shouldn't use Mark's approach or David's approach exclusively to crack cases. You're also going to read about frameworks. So Porter's 5 Forces, the 4 P's of marketing, the 3 C's of business. These are frameworks that you want to leverage but not use exclusively to crack cases. So this is really talking to approach. So how do you succeed? You have to develop a creative, customized approach to solve a problem. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can create this creative approach, but something to keep in your mind right now, whether you've started practicing or are going to be starting practice soon, you have to come up with your own customized approach to solve the problem. Now, you're going to leverage perhaps Porter's 5 Forces. You may leverage the 3 C's. You may leverage Mark Cosentino's Case in Pointer. It's called the IV case system. You're going to leverage that, but you're not going to use that exclusively. So this is an important point. You cannot walk into an interview and say, okay, well, I'm going to use Porter's 5 Forces to solve this problem. You cannot do that. You also have to show that you're intellectually curious and you genuinely enjoy the process. And I think this is a good way for you to self-select out of recruiting preparation. If you start to practice cases and you really don't like it, you're probably not going to be successful in the case interview, and perhaps you may not even like the actual work in the consulting industry. So you have to genuinely enjoy the case process and be very intellectually curious, enjoy the problem-solving process. You have to demonstrate strong business acumen regardless of the topic. So you don't have a business background, but that doesn't mean that you haven't done research and homework in business topics and current business issues. So one of the things you need to start doing is read the newspaper. New York Times in Canada, it's the Globe and Mail, so the report on business. So read the business section so that you understand the business issues and topics that are salient in the market right now. And also on my website, finalroundprep.com, I have a section where you can learn more about the general business concepts that you're going to need to leverage in a case interview. I've got links to books and blogs and that sort of thing. You have to show poise and confidence throughout the case, even when pressed. So, of course, they're going to put a little bit of pressure on you. How do you manage that? You need to be able to manage through that very comfortably. Passion for problem solving. I think this speaks a little bit to the intellectual curiosity and genuinely enjoying the process, but you have to be really energetic and excited about the problem that they're giving you. That solves that. One thing I wanted to add to the passion for problem solving, an example of how you can demonstrate this, I know that at the end of every case, I was genuinely interested to know, and I asked the consultant, they said, do you have any questions for me? And I would say, yeah, I have a quick sort of preliminary question. The case that you gave me, was this a case you worked on, and what was the outcome? And I was genuinely curious to know. So that, it's sort of an example of being passionate and curious and enjoying the consulting process. Okay? So again, drilling deeper into case interviews. At a high level, there are 3 case type categories. And a case interview may have components of each. So what I've done here is laid them out. So the foundation of case interviews are, quite simply called business cases. Okay, so the case examples that I provided to you on that slide, those are business cases. These are the cases that you're going to get 99% of the time. But there are also some other sort of types of business problems or cases you need to be aware of. One is market sizing. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk about market sizing in much greater detail. Mark Cosentino's book, Case in Point, actually explores market sizing questions in very great detail. So you definitely want to pick up that book and leverage that. And also brain teasers. Now, brain teasers like, why are manhole covers round? How many golf balls can you fit in a 747? Or actually, how much paint would it take to paint a 747? So sort of brain teaser questions. I can tell you with regard to brain teasers, I've only seen one brain teaser pop up in the last 4 years from one firm. So it's not likely that you'd get one, but there's a possibility you will. So you want to familiarize yourself with that. So in terms of prepping, business cases, of course, any case that you get, on the internet from a school case pack, from one of the case prep books, those are business cases, but you also need to familiarize yourself and practice market sizing and at least practice a couple brain teasers. Okay, so in terms of what does a case interview feel like from a process perspective, or what sort of steps does it go through? And I think this is important to introduce because, once you understand what a case is and you start practicing, there are certain rules you have to follow. The analogy that I use is sort of like the rules of the road, right? Light turns red, you have to stop, wait for it to turn green. If the sign says don't turn right, you can't turn right. Perhaps you can, you get a ticket. But the idea is there are certain rules you need to be aware of in order to drive on the road. Well, there are certain rules you need to be aware of as it relates to case interviews and how they flow. So just a quick intro here. The way the case is going to work, the interviewer is going to present you with a problem, typically verbally. And I say verbally because Monitor, which is now part of a Deloitte, they would actually give the candidate slides. So you would get a series of slides, perhaps 10 or 15 PowerPoint slides, and you'd be required to go through all those slides, pull slides out you thought were relevant, and answer a question that was posed to you at the beginning of the interview. But typically you're going to get presented with the problem verbally. The first thing you're going to do is clarify facts. So you're going to make sure that you understand the information that was presented to you. Okay. Then you're going to actually literally say to the interviewer, I'm going to go ahead and take a minute to collect my thoughts. And this is a minute of quiet reflection. And when I say minute, I don't mean 5 minutes. I mean 60 to 90 seconds maximum. And this is when you're thinking about how you want to approach the problem. Okay. Then you're going to share that approach with the interviewer and ask for feedback. Typically you'd say, does this approach seem reasonable to you? And they may give you a little bit of feedback about how they feel about your approach. And then the next step is really that collaborative Q&A that I was talking about. So this is where you're going to be working through the problem with the consultant. Near the end of the case, it's going to be time to come up with a recommendation. And you're going to take another minute of quiet reflection to come up with that recommendation. So really, during a case, there's only 2 times when you're able to be quiet without saying anything. Other than that, you should be thinking out loud and talking to the consultant the entire time. Near the end of the case, when it's time to develop a recommendation, you take another minute of quiet reflection, come up with that recommendation, and then you're going to share that recommendation, okay? So in terms of the steps, these are the steps you need to follow when you're giving a case to your practice partners and when you're receiving a case, okay? Now, I just have the slide here. Recall the consulting process. A case interview follows a very similar structure. So objective and approach, data collection, analysis, findings, recommendations. The point here is, even though you're solving a problem in a very condensed time frame, 25 to 30 minutes typically is how long a case interview takes, you're really going to be going through the same types of steps you would in a real consulting project, a real consulting environment. And so those books I shared, the McKinsey Mind in designing solutions for your business problems by Betty Vandenbosch. If you read those books, there's a really good opportunity for you to learn a lot about how to solve problems. Sorry about that. I just have to get back to full screen here. Okay. So now in terms of preparation plan, okay, so again, I understand this is coming at you, very hard and very fast. There's a lot of information I'm presenting to you, but what can you do as the next step to really start to prep, so where the rubber meets the road, okay? So I think you should break down the preparation process into 3 different steps. Now, I just have some suggested timeframes there, around 2 weeks, 2 to 3 months. You may have more time, fantastic. You may have less time, that's okay. I mean, I've actually worked with clients that have only had 2 to 3 weeks to prep, and they've been successful and landed offers. So ideally, you're going to practice more rather than less. So here's some suggested time frames. Now, the first step is prepping individually, so prepping on your own. In terms of the resources, I'm going to suggest that you leverage Case in Point by Mark Cosentino. Buy that book. And by the way, I do not receive financial compensation for telling you that. I know Mark. I think he's a fantastic coach. Why not share with my clients the resources that I think are really going to help them? Pick up his book. It's one of the first things you should do. They say it's like the Bible of consulting prep, and they call Mark the godfather of consulting interview preparation. So definitely pick up that book. Crack the Case is another book you want to pick up. The website is mbacase.com. Caseinterview.com. So that's a website that was started by an individual named Victor Chang. He's a former McKinsey consultant. You have to sign up, but he has some great free videos of a workshop he did at Harvard in cracking cases. He's got a lot of fantastic blog posts. He's got some products you can purchase. He's got a new book called Case Interview Secrets, so definitely leverage that website. And then I have here, there are school case packs and intros in Harvard. So there are case packs out there in the market. So the Harvard case pack, the Wharton case pack, the Columbia case pack. What these are basically preparation guides that were developed by consulting clubs for their members. So they have, information about the interview process, frameworks, but more importantly, they have actual practice cases that are included. Now, these are the cases that you can use to practice with your classmates. And the Harvard case pack is actually a fantastic introduction to consulting and has some good cases that you can read through on your own. Okay. And incidentally, if you don't have access to any of those case packs, you can just drop me an email. You can go to my website at finalroundprep.com or send me an email, Darren@finalroundprep.com. I'd be happy to provide you some of the case packs I've got. Now, I've got a list here in terms of order. I'm going to leave you to read this on your own, but in terms of prepping with each other, leverage those case packs. Once you're done getting good at cases, there's a lot of great practice cases on the websites. So BCG has an interactive case. Bain has cases that are very similar to the types of cases they give in the real world. So don't discount the websites as a good preparation resource, but at the same time, don't practice them right away. You want to get exposed to case interviews and do some practice first before you go to the websites. If you go to the websites now today, you're not going to get as good of a learning opportunity because you're not really going to be sure what you're doing. So practice first before you go to the firm websites, then advance to the more detailed cases in Case in Point and Crack the Case. And caseinterview.com, there's a product called Look Over My Shoulder, LOMS. It's something you may want to consider purchasing. Victor has recorded himself giving cases and providing feedback, so it's a tool that you may want to leverage. And again, I don't receive compensation here. I just think it's a good resource that's available to you. Now, in terms of what can you do next, I would encourage you to consider practicing with an expert or an alumni. So if there's an alumni of the school or even a friend or a colleague that's in consulting, they're one of the best resources you can use to practice cases with. So if you can do that, absolutely do that. But there are also experts in the market that can practice interviews with you as well. So of course, I'm one of them. So I do this is primarily what I've been doing in January and February is prepping students for summer internships. I'll practice with them on Skype. So we'll be face to face and I'll be giving them a case and, giving them feedback. It's a good practice opportunity. Mark Cosentino offers service like that. David Raval does. So there's a lot of resources out there in terms of experts, but I would encourage the people that are very serious about consulting to consider leveraging an expert as part of their preparation process. Okay? Now, sort of done with the case interview. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the question box and I'll cover those off. So I just wanted to now shift gears and talk about consulting applications. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. In terms of what I'm going to talk about, I would encourage people on the webinar today, send me an email. Again, Darren@finalroundprep.com. I can email you out some resources that you can read to help develop a good resume and cover letter. And one of them is actually an example consulting resume that landed the candidate interviews with every single major consulting firm. So I can send that to you. Send me an email. I'd be happy to do that. Okay. But in terms of your application, so your cover letter and your resume, what is it that the firms are looking for specifically? Okay. There you go. The best way I can describe it is they're looking for Olympic level general athletes. Okay. So the idea is that no matter what sport, to use an analogy, no matter what sport they throw at you, you're able to play it at an Olympic level. So I mean, to translate that to sort of business terminology, no matter what industry or functional area or business problem you're faced with, you have to be able to perform at a very high level. So there's a stat that's floating around. I can't verify this, but they say that less than 2% of global applicants receive an interview, and less than 1%, or sometimes less than 0.5% of candidates receive an offer. So it's extremely competitive. I mean, they're looking for Olympic level thinkers, performers, business problem solvers. So in terms of the skills that you need to possess as a consultant, and I think thinking about your applications, this is very important. I've listed a number of them on the slide, and I think you can read this on your own. But the two I wanted to call to your attention: leadership and analytics. Okay, if you can't demonstrate that you are a strong leader, you will not get an interview with a consulting firm. And you don't necessarily have to have had a lot of experience leading people. Because in consulting, you may be leading a project where you have no one on your team. You don't have an analyst, you don't have other analysts, you don't have associates or other associates. It's just you and a manager, perhaps you and a principal, working on a project. So the idea of leadership is more than just leading people. It's about leading a piece of work. And I've actually worked with a lot of PhD students where I coach them through coming up with examples for their resumes and also in behavioral or fit interviews about them working through a particular project or problem that they faced and structuring it in a way that it shows that they have good project-based experience. And that's actually leading a project or leading a piece of work. So demonstrate that you've led work, that you've led projects. It doesn't necessarily have to be leading people. And then analytics. Of course, analytics is more than just math, but primarily why McKinsey and BCG are interested in you as candidates is because you have scientific and technical experience and backgrounds. So you have to demonstrate that on your applications, your resume. And one of the best ways you can do this is by quantifying results. Okay, so here's an example of that I went through. I'm just saying illustratively. I mean, we'll talk about a good impact statement, but here's the context. Here's what I did, and the result or outcome was, and you're going to leverage a percentage and or a dollar figure or something of that nature. So having a lot of quantifiable results in your resume is really a good way to demonstrate your analytical capabilities. And of course, they're looking for creative thinkers, good communicators, good teamwork folks, and client relationships. I think these are skills. I think they're relatively straightforward that you would expect any industry is looking for in good candidates. Also consulting firms, but I think what differentiates consulting firms is their emphasis on leadership and analytics and problem solving. Now, in terms of what they're looking for, and I think that, this speaks to everyone in the audience today. Do you have to have business experience? Absolutely not. You don't have to have business or consulting experience. So if you look at this 2x2, if you're low on capability and low on experience, well, quite frankly, you're probably not doing your degree right now. You're not in school. Okay. So, you're not going to be low. If you have high experience, but low capability, I mean, that's not something that they're looking for. But again, that's likely not you, everyone that's in the audience in the webinar today. I would argue that everyone that has joined today has high capability, but is low on the experience scale. So low business experience and low consulting experience. This is the sweet spot for the consulting firms. They're hiring a majority of their candidates out of that star area. Now, are you a rock star? Maybe you are. Maybe you have a lot of work experience and you're highly capable. Those candidates do exist, but primarily most of the candidates that are applying and are successful are high in terms of capability, but just don't have that experience. And I have here, a kicker here, or a tombstone, it's called in a slide. A focus on capability is why top firms hire doctors, lawyers, physicists, mathematicians, and PhDs in origami. So it's a true story. So one of the top firms hired someone with a PhD in origami. When I heard this story, I said to myself, I didn't realize you could get a PhD in origami. Well, apparently you can, and you can, okay? So anyone's interested in perhaps pursuing a PhD outside of their current field, maybe you want to do origami. This particular individual is working for NASA. So they were trying to come up with ways to better fold down solar panels to send up into space, because of course, obviously it's very expensive to send any kind of mass into space. And why would a top firm hire that particular individual? They're a creative thinker, they're a good problem solver, they're highly analytical. So there's great opportunities out there for people that are not business students, which arguably is everyone on the webinar today. So this is good news. Okay. So in terms of resume, I don't want to scare anyone here, because I know that likely most folks in the audience have more than a one-page resume, but you have to come up with a one-page resume to submit to consulting applications. You can't have 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. It's not easy. I totally understand and accept that. A lot of the work I do with my private clients is in helping them condense the information they have on multiple pages down into one page, but there's an expectation from the consulting firms that you will submit an application with one page. If you have more than one page, perhaps on the second page, it's considered something like an appendix, where maybe you have listed out publications that you're in, that sort of thing. But the one-page resume, this is what they expect, and you have to demonstrate that you've got the skills to do the job with this one page. Pretty straightforward in terms of format. And again, send me an email, darren@finalroundprep.com, and be happy to provide you with an example in terms of format. There's also an example format you can download from my website for free. But education comes at the top, work experience, and then activities and interests at the bottom. But key point here, one page. Now, in terms of the content on the document, so you want to write impact statements, okay? So when you think of typical resumes, it's usually the points, bullet points, are descriptive, right? So you're trying to demonstrate the type of work you were doing so they understand the context. But a good impact statement and a good consulting resume is going to have impact statements that have a context, an action, or actions and a result, okay? So in terms of kind of a definition here, each entry in your resume needs to share a little bit of background with that particular example, and actually each impact statement needs to be about one specific work experience example. So you don't want to be saying, developed multiple models and pluralizing things. It's one specific example is what you want to do with your impact statements. You can't have multiple examples in one impact statement. But context, a little bit of description, actions, this is critical. So what were the things you were doing specifically as part of that example? And then the result is, what was the outcome? And here's where you can really demonstrate impact. And of course, the idea is, do you have a strong percentage or dollar figure that you can associate with that? You don't always have that, but ideally that's what you want to target. So I'm just going to, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but the first bullet, and then becomes, and then it's been updated or fixed. Here are some examples that I've pulled out of actual resumes that I've reviewed. And they're not good impact statements. On the surface, they seem relatively descriptive, but they're not good impact statements. So here's some examples of how you need to fix what perhaps you may have on your resume currently, or if you're starting to develop a consulting resume, what you need to come up with in terms of the components of a good impact statement. I'll just quickly walk through the first one. Analyze complex data and identified ideal pricing structure for a company's product line. This does not have the specific actions associated with the analysis they conducted. There's really no quantifiable outcome or impact. So how can you develop that into a good impact statement? Developed a product pricing optimization model for a high-profile revenue improvement project. So there's a little bit more contextual detail. By doing what? So now you get into the actions. By analyzing complex customer usage data. And then what was the result? Revised pricing resulted in a 25% increase in customer base in less than 1 year. So structurally, this has a context, it has actions, and it has a result. And I'll leave you to read the other examples that I've provided on this slide. Okay. Now, just quickly recall the skills the consulting firms are looking for. So I've already shared this, but print off this slide and have it beside you when you're writing these impact statements. So you need to think, am I demonstrating via these examples and via the actions, more specifically within these impact statements, that I have the skills required to do consulting? And here they are: leadership and analytics, so on and so forth. So use this as a guide. And when you're writing these impact statements, make sure that you're demonstrating you have these skills, okay? The bottom of the resume, this is actually pretty important. So activities and interests, some people call it other. Please do not call it other. Be more descriptive than that. But this is kind of the section that makes you real, okay? So what volunteer work have you done? Extracurricular activities that you're involved in. This is sometimes a place where folks will put their awards. To me, the question you need to be able to answer here is, what makes you unique? The airport test. So here's an example from my resume in 2006. So this is the resume that I used to apply to all the major consulting firms, and you can read some examples there. The very bottom, though, amateur magician and guitar player. So by the way, that's true. I don't really do much magic anymore now, but I actually used to do magic for fun. I do still play the guitar. Every single consulting firm that brought me in for an interview asked me about the magician point. They said, "Are you really an amateur magician?" I said, yes. And two firms, so A.T. Kearney and Deloitte, they asked me to do a magic trick in the interview, which I did. I actually brought a deck of cards and I did a magic trick. So this is something that's actually very, very important for you to include on your resume, okay? Points that make you unique, make you different, and they'll help the consultant or the recruiter better understand your overall profile and not just your professional and academic background. Now, sort of to close this off, I've developed a formula for developing strong impact statement. I think this is good for all the PhDs and science students on the webinar today. So in terms of what does a good impact statement look like, we know it as context, action, and results. Well, you can actually use this formula to develop a good impact statement, okay? So your beginning action verb, every impact statement has to start with an action verb, plus the details or the context. That forms the context. So the action verb in and of itself is not enough to demonstrate your skills, the actions associated with that example. It's part of the context. If you remember that, you actually can start to write some good impact statements, okay? So action verb plus some details or context. The next component in the formula is the 1, 2, or 3 key actions associated with that action verb, the by doing what. So if you developed, by doing what? If you led, XYZ, by doing what, okay? So answer the question. Whatever that beginning action verb was, I need to share what I was doing specifically in order to execute on that action verb. And then the results, ideally a percentage or a dollar figure, but if not, you need a very specific qualitative outcome. So you want to avoid saying things like completed project on time and under budget. Avoid that. That does not demonstrate to a recruiter that you've had impact, and likewise that you're going to have impact on the work that you do for them and their clients. Okay? I've put this slide in, I've talked to this, but I just want to make sure that everyone's aware that in consulting, leadership is more than just about leading people. So I'll leave this up to you to read. And I just have there, actually in the middle, banking example. So, I did project work for one of the major Canadian banks, and I had no one on my team. So it was just me. Now there were other consultants doing work on other work streams, but I had no analyst. I didn't have any other associates. I was doing the work by myself, and I was reporting to a manager. So just an example of leading without actually leading people. And of course, I was regularly meeting internally with the firm. I was meeting with the client. I was developing all of the documents to share with the client, so on and so forth, doing all the work. That's leadership in a consulting context. Okay? Now, just wanted to share a couple things that I think are pretty interesting. These are resumes that I entered into a cloud-based program. I can't recall the one that I used online, but developed a word cloud. So the resume that I'm going to actually send everyone that's interested, I input this into the word cloud program, and here's what it spit out, okay? So visually, here are, you can look at this and determine what are the key messages that are being sent on a consulting resume. So kind of think about like this. As a recruiter and as a person that has that experience, when I take a look at a resume, I know what I'm looking for. So these are the types of things that are going to jump out at me. Okay, so in terms of the words and the ideas that this particular resume is portraying, here's a good example visually. And again, you're going to get these slides so you can look at this by yourself. I thought this was interesting. So a non-traditional background, a political background this candidate had, they received interviews from top consulting firms, interview requests, and they actually landed an offer at an MBB firm. What did their resume look like? Well, here are some of the key sort of terms and ideas that were presented on that resume. I think pretty interesting. And I've included this for everyone here on the webinar. So here is an advanced degree, so a PhD student that only had academics in their background. So they had no professional work experience. They got an interview from an MBB firm and they actually landed a job. Okay, so this may be a lot of people in the audience right now. What are the things that are going to be jumping off a good advanced degree or PhD candidate's consulting resume? Here's an example visually of the things that are really going to jump off the page and grab the attention of the recruiter. Okay, so closing off here, fit or personal experience questions. I mean, you can't be successful in a consulting interview without doing quite well in the behavioral component. So there's a number of areas you need to think about and prep for. They're going to ask questions about your work experience. They may talk to you a little bit about your education. So why did you choose to do studies in this particular field? They will likely ask you a question about goals. So where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years? So you need to start thinking about what your career trajectory is going to look like. You need to know the consulting industry and about the firm. So McKinsey is very likely to ask you, why do you want to work for our firm? Okay, so it's important that you know what's unique about McKinsey and why does you want to work there versus perhaps other firms. They may test your general business acumen. So again, I commented on reading the business section of the newspaper. So this is something that you want to do regularly. And of course, reverse interview, you need to have questions ready to ask them at the end. And this is a great example to demonstrate your preparedness, your interest, your passion, so on and so forth. And in terms of preparing responses to behavioral questions, I mean, generally speaking, they being just, experts or topics or resources that you're going to find online or in books, that you should use a very similar format to an impact statement. Tell me about a time when you led a team here on a successful project or missed a deadline. I'll talk about positive versus negative, but you should have a context as part of that response, actions, so what did you do specifically, and then what the result or outcome was. So you want to make sure that you're leveraging that type of context, action, result framework when you answer any sort of behavioral question. But I want to introduce the concept of CARL. So I think it's an acronym that's not hard to remember. So learned, because when you get behavioral questions, they're going to come at you in one of two ways. Okay, so they're either going to be a positive or a neutral tone, have a positive or neutral tone. So on a successful project, it's an example of a positive tone, but they may come at you in a negative tone. So, and you missed a deadline. So anytime you get a question with a negative tone or some sort of negative connotation, what they're looking for is, what did you learn from that experience? And how did you adjust moving forward, or how did you solve that problem from happening again in the future? Okay, so context, action, results is a good way to answer these questions. If it's got a negative tone or negative connotation, remember, share with them what you learned from that particular example. And here are the common behavioral questions you're going to get. Quite frankly, I don't want to say don't practice anything other than these, but if you practice just these, you probably would do pretty good. So I think this is a fairly comprehensive list of the types of questions you may face. For sure, they will say, walk me through your resume or tell me about yourself. Why consulting? Why do you want to work at our firm? They may not say, why should we hire you? But it's something that I encourage people to think about. I mean, if you can't, for example, convince me that a consulting firm should hire you, you're definitely not going to be able to convince a consulting firm to hire you. So something to think about. And then the tell me about a time when type questions, leadership they'll test, influence, persuasiveness, can you influence senior stakeholders, initiative, so, doing things outside of the scope of your particular role, whether it's academically or professional. They're also going to ask about challenges relating back to some of these topics. So a challenge with a client, challenge with a team, challenge with another person. and then examples that demonstrate your analytical, modeling, or problem-solving capabilities. Incidentally, one question I got from a couple firms was, tell me about a time when you leverage data to solve a problem. It's a tough question if you haven't really thought about it. Okay, so with that, again, wanted to apologize that we rushed through, some of the content. Again, in the interest of time, I just wanted to make sure that you were given as much information as possible in the time that we had. And I wanted to just remind you, my website, finalroundprep.com, all the resources that I talked about today and a whole lot more are all available for free on my site. I've organized it in a way that's going to really help you go through it sort of systematically. I have guided learning chapters and links to all the major resources I think you should leverage. And if there's anyone that's interested in practicing, just send me an email and I'd be happy to give you some help.